Okay, hi there. I'm Marie Ora. I am the founder of the Ora Report, which is a conflict prediction model, which I use in an attempt to analyze better than what I was finding, how conflicts start and what are the signs that a region is headed to a conflict. So I actually did a PhD in the law of war, and I didn't complete it because I took a different turn. I started speaking to mercenaries, soldiers, combat vets, special forces, and so on. And I was asking them very specific questions I wanted to know. And if I may just go back to a bit of my history, I was born in the north of Namibia. And we used to go to Angola all of the time. And it was a safe, friendly place to be. It was lovely. And then one day we went there, and this is just the start of the trouble. We were in an insurrection, basically, an uprising. And it never left me that this place had always been so peaceful and quiet. There had been no signs of war. And then one day it was absolute hell broke loose, and we could never go back there again. And so at the back of my mind was always, we had this, it was the Cold War and the Soviets and all of these bigger questions. But I wanted to know, how did this start on the ground? How did people get to the point where such an uprising could occur overnight? Because that is how it happened. And so when I started studying the subject, I was actually looking at the war in Yugoslavia in 1999, Milosevic, butcher of the Balkans, and so on. And I wasn't finding what I wanted to know, which is more or less, why would the Serbs have sort of overnight become extremely hostile to the Kosovars and started attacking and butchering them? Wasn't getting an answer out of the academic side, and that is why I then started looking for mercenaries, soldiers, and so on. Mercenaries is not that hard to find where I am, because I live in South Africa. Many of my generation were in the border war, which is Angola, against the Soviet Union. And a lot of them couldn't integrate back into normal life. And so they became mercenaries as a sort of a adaptive way of dealing with reality, because they couldn't get back into a normal civilian lifestyle. So using what I learned from them, I started to watch very specific hard metrics. I wanted to take ideology out of it, take freedom fighters and all of these things out of it, and see if I could find a more hard set of metrics that would indicate a war was brewing. And what it boiled down to for me was, I started looking at, where are the bases? Where are the military bases? Where is the oil and gas? Where are the mines? Because every single person I spoke to, invariably something about the mines would come up. And so that then became the basis of my Ora report. And every time I hear that, is there a whiff of trouble, the first thing I do is I go and look through, where are the military bases? Is there any troop movement? What is the supply chain looking like? And more importantly, where is the oil and gas? What pipelines are they? Where are they being built? Where are they being planned?
Amazing stuff. So it's my privilege to be on your podcast, and I'm Ian Thornton-Trump. I'm the CISO of Cyjax. My university background and military service has been Eastern European studies, and along with the Middle East. I think that one of the interesting things that you pull out of this, and I think it is kind of almost right and proper to pull out of it, is the ideology, because in addition to the Eastern European studies stuff, I also studied religious theology and apocalyptic cults. So one of the more interesting aspects of this is that Africa, in its simplest sort of analysis, comes down to the very things that you talked about. It's a nexus of East-West power, always has been since the colonial era. And then I think when you talk about the mines and the resources, that is the play. There isn't really a high-tech industry in Africa per se, like an indigenously built high-tech industry. So it is about natural resources. It is about the control and power. And so, I'm excited to talk with you because this is sort of our ability to peer inside and get the South African perspective on the world events that are sort of like at the shores of Africa.
Yes, and that's very interesting, by the way. I'm fascinated that you studied theology with the apocalyptic element in it as well. Because even though I don't take that into account when I am doing my sort of geopolitics research, at the back of my mind, there's always a slight wonder if there isn't something bigger brewing. There are so many things going wrong. I'm just wondering, how much do you know about what is going on in Africa at the moment?
Well, it's really interesting. So from the North American perspective and sort of following what the think tanks are telling us and the kind of the more in-depth studies and research, we see Africa right now going through a transition, and some African countries experimenting with sort of a democracy in one form or another. But complicating this mess, if you will, is the fact that the resources that Africa have are very desirable by Chinese controlling influences for commercial, Russian influence for exploitation and use to fund their ongoing wars, which, I do say the plural because they have been at war in Syria for a great period of time, not to mention other small, I would call them almost fisticuffs, and sort of the mercenary culture that Russia has built. And then finally is the sudden realization of the Western democratic powers that continued aid to Africa is not sustainable from a development perspective. And that could be due to the endemic corruption of the various African governments, but it's also that, you're not building any indigenous capacity within those countries by just, continuing to send foodstuffs and grains. Whereas China has come in and massively invested in infrastructure in a lot of cases, including both Russia and China building ports so that they have the ability to project power in the region. And these were things that that the Western powers got, I think, outmaneuvered by Chinese and Russian opportunism within Africa. The other thing that we know about Africa is that the concentration of wealth within Africa has led to a situation where you have a incredibly affluent ruling class and incredibly poverty-ridden I'm going to say poor class. And this has become a ripe breeding ground, Nigeria being a great example of this, for Islamic terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism being exported mostly by Iran, but that's not to say that other groups aren't entrenching themselves in what they see as a kind of a opportunity for recruiting, folks that are dedicated to a cause of sort of a fundamentalist view of Islam. So it's incredibly complicated. The geopolitical realities of access to resources plays out at the same time that Africa is coming under unprecedented development in some countries. Other countries have been sort of abandoned by the African powers completely as sort of failed states. So that's the view that I have from sort of my very Western sort of look at it. What would you say contrasts with you being on the ground in South Africa?
I would say, first of all, what you said about China. I mean, in South Africa, we are practically a colony of China. That would be, and they're very low key and they're very low profile, but they do certainly run all the mines and they do certainly have control of infrastructure. I don't know if you're aware that oil was recently found off the coast of South Africa, as well as Namibia. And actually, a friend of mine said, because the news that it had been found only came earlier this year, a few weeks ago, and then a friend of mine said they are already building pipelines in Namibia. So resources, it's sort of a blessing if the native population actually derived any benefit. But other than that, the discovery filled me with absolute dread because having looked around at war zones, they tend to be very much centered around oil and gas. Now, South Africa itself, I did not realize. I understood the Chinese influence. What I did not understand was how much influence Iran has in South Africa. And that only came out recently. Just looking at the continent as a whole, we have, as you say, it's a lot of war zones. We've got Central African Republic, and it's a mess over there. And Nigeria, we've just had another jihadist attack on, I think they kidnapped 300 schoolgirls.
That's right.
Are you aware of jihadism in Southern Africa?
So interesting. It was usually the poor North African countries that seem to be, being influenced. And I can remember troop deployments, French and Canadians in Mali, as well as the DRC and places like that. Mm-hmm. I wasn't aware of sort of the as much influence or potential operational support into the southern part of Africa, and it's a bit surprising because I would say it's not that surprising because fundamental Islam has a tendency to move like a plague through regions that are suffering economic crisis or leadership vacuums. So the extent, though, of that penetration, if you will, it comes as disturbing news, I think, is the easiest way to characterize it.
I would most certainly describe it as disturbing. For a couple of years now, we've been aware our neighboring country to the east is Mozambique, and I don't know if you know about Boko Haram. There's a massive Boko Haram cell in Cabo Delgado. And in fact, they have also filtered down into KwaZulu-Natal, which is one of the South African provinces. And they've been sitting there very quietly and not problematically for us. However, in Mozambique, we've had a number of horrific massacres. And the South African government oddly refused to get involved. Mozambique asked for help and they just looked the other way. They haven't taken any notice whatsoever of this type of activity. I couldn't understand it. And then recently, when South Africa took Israel to the ICJ, some information came to light which was absolutely staggering to me, and that was that, in fact, the ANC rulership has had a long and prosperous, shall we say, involvement with Iran going back more than a decade, probably a bit longer than that. And in fact, there are several cases filed in the United States under anti-terrorism legislation.
Right.
Naming MTN, which is a major telecommunications giant in South Africa, which was at the time of where the complaint originates from, headed by the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. And I went and I dug up the court papers because it was just so jarring. And I had a look at them, and the contents are basically that Cyril Ramaphosa, along with other members of high up politics and very influential in the business world, where they had something called Project Snooker, wherein they were helping Iran to basically get around sanctions with things like nuclear votes, with things like buying defensive weapons they're not entitled to have. And then it came to light that the ANC, this is an election year, they were very heavily in debt, and suddenly their debts were wiped off. And everything points to Iran having covered that debt. Now, whether Iran covers it directly or whether it goes through someone like country like Qatar, I don't know. But definitely it would appear that the ICJ was not an internal decision from South Africa where they really, really cared about the Palestinians, because they don't care about the Nigerians being killed and they don't care about the Mozambicans being killed by jihadis, but they do care very much about the Palestinians. So it looks to many people, including myself, that this was a PR campaign and Iran is behind it.
Yeah, and I think the cultivation of sympathy towards Iran is part of the longer term strategy that Iran has to get folks in their back pocket in terms of potential UN votes and things like that. And interestingly enough, Saudi Arabia did something similar, obviously not involving the International Criminal Court of Justice, but they wrote a giant check to Tunisia to get rid of Tunisia's debt. So clearly that Shia versus Sunni geopolitical rivalry, which has been in place since about 1946 when we arbitrarily decided the borders of the Middle East, is playing itself out in Africa as well as the sort of certainly Iran senses an opportunity space there. What I think is rather interesting and is pivotal is the role that Egypt could play in Africa. And I would be really curious to hear your thoughts on Egypt, because from the Western viewpoint, Egypt's breadbasket and agricultural output could conceivably deal with most of the African issues with regards to food security, but I guess they've never decided to leverage that position. What are your thoughts?
Egypt has been very much out of the discussion in Africa and certainly in South Africa. You never hear about Egypt as such. I do agree with you, they could play a far greater role. I think what you mentioned over here about the Sunni-Shia divide may be a factor. Now, Saudi Arabia, Sunni, and so Tunisia, I assume, is Sunni as well. And what I'm seeing is that Iran may be a factor in Egypt laying low, because Iran is terrified of the Muslim Brotherhood and any form of jihadi contagion, because, as you know, the minute they start up in any country that they find themselves in, you have an explosion of trouble. I think also the reason that they have perhaps laid low might be because they're letting Saudi Arabia, they don't want to step on toes of Iran or Saudi Arabia. That would be it.
Yeah, it's interesting though that he somehow seemed to think that they're not part of Africa.
Yeah.
Like, is it a cultural divide issue, or is it, they've been sort of so embroiled in the Middle East and Arab Spring uprising that they're much more firmly in that Arabian sphere of influence than they are in an African sphere of influence?
Sub-Saharan Africa is a different world to North Africa.
Okay.
We've got this massive Sahara Desert in between, and the ethnicity, cultures, traditions, everything changes once you cross over the Sahara. And then you get a more Islamic influence on the countries which are on the edge of the Sahara and therefore closer to North Africa. But really, you're not looking, when we speak about Africa, we mean sub-Saharan Africa. And North Africa tends to be put into, it might as well be a continent of its own. It's so different ethnically, religiously, in every single way. A lot of tension between the various ethnicities as well. There tends to be a tendency from North Africa to look down on sub-Saharan Africa. And I must just mention that sub-Saharan Africa, you almost have to take in, if you go around to Somalia, because Somalia considers themselves part of the Arab world. So everything north of the Sahara, along with Somalia, even though it's on the east coast over there, you would look at as North Africa and Islamic Africa. And then and so that is where the divide is really, and why we don't have that much to do with them.
Let's talk a little bit about mining, because mining and oil, we touched on Nigeria and its oil reserves. We touched on the potential of offshore oil reserve in other African countries. In this post-Soviet, now Russian era of influence, are African countries then looking for Russian or Chinese technology to do the extractive resources, or is it more about bringing those minerals to market? What is the connection? Like, why are African countries allowing that investment and instead of not doing it sort of indigenously?
Well, the reason they're not doing it indigenously is because there is so much disarray and, basically poverty and financial problems and all of these things. They don't have their act together to be able to do it. That's one side of it. The other side of it is, why bother for leaders when Russia and China will come in and do it all for you, and and you'll
receive your cut, right? Like
exactly that. So I was actually so concerned at one point because I saw China coming in and taking over mine after mine after mine. And I was looking at the USA and sort of the Western countries generally and thinking, but aren't they noticing this? Because if they had to come in now at this point, it wouldn't be a big deal if they came and said, okay, well, we'll give you some more money and we'll take some of these mines. And I mean, there are some mines like vanadium, for instance. I think there are only 3 main sources of vanadium in the world, which are used for steel making. Russia, China, and South Africa. And as far as I'm aware, South Africa is the biggest. And if that is used for steel making, I was looking at the United States, and well, Germany has not deindustrialized itself, but I was thinking, if they ever wanted to take steel making back, how would they do it if they didn't have access, to these resources anymore? And nobody seemed to be very interested. From your side, is there a reason why the sort of everyone took their eye off the ball for so long?
Well, I think it was that Western democracies are constrained from doing things in the financial services and relationship building that is part of African culture. So what I would mean by that is it is perfectly reasonable for a Chinese businessman or a Russian businessman to hand a large envelope of money to book an appointment to talk to the upper leaders of government. In the West, we consider that, a bribery.
Fine.
And so we put ourselves at an economic disadvantage. And I also think we didn't take African governance or the potential of African governance seriously. I mean, when we look at the UK's government policy right now, they want very much to be able to send asylum seekers to the country of Rwanda. To the point where they're trying to pass a law in the British Parliament that essentially declares Rwanda as a safe country. And the empirical measure of a safe country, Rwanda does not tick the boxes at all. And so this is where we're looking at Africa as a potential dumping ground for the unwanted people from the United Kingdom. We're not looking at it through the lens of economic development. We're looking at it as a corrupt place where the people need to be saved. I mean, I think there's that post-colonial mentality plus racism equals our African policy. And I don't think we've changed that African policy since, basically we continued to put money in and got no results, and people continued to starve, and there continued to be famine. And we're sitting there going, well, this is like, writing an endless check. And this was because we weren't prepared. We were on our moral high horse. We weren't prepared to do business the African way. And as a result, the Chinese and the Russians easily were maybe perhaps a little bit more morally flexible, but they simply moved in and dealt with the African governments such as they are in the way that the African government wanted to be dealt with, instead of trying to westernize the governance of African countries before we would actually deem them worthy of doing business. And this all comes to a head in the country of Nigeria, where the availability of the oil resources in the offshore part of Nigeria is a high-tech problem. And it requires some of the biggest mines in the world, BT, Shell, Halliburton, and others, in order to extract those resources from that difficult geographical position that they're in, right? Right. So there, in a sense, there's been this Western dependency, and for the Nigerian government, it's clear that if the West decided that the Nigerian government isn't doing something that the West needs them to do, the West can just sort of easily make it more difficult for Nigeria and the people of Nigeria by exerting that economic dominance that they have over extractive resources. And I think what's happening is we're seeing that the strings that we've attached to the governance and behavior of countries from our comfortable Western position just does not work. And so when the Chinese and the Russians I'm going to see the Russians will have somewhat dated technology. The Chinese might have the equivalent of or slightly better, depending on the amount of tech investment that Chinese have made. And this is now the alternative play. So if you're an African, president of a country, if doing business with the West has all of these strings attached, and anti-corruption and and sort of like anti-good behavior requirements, I mean, you're going to go with the path of least resistance, and you're going to go with an investment partner that is not interested in the internal politics of your country, is simply there for the raw economic opportunism with, very few strings attached. Again, we're being outmaneuvered, and we haven't, we've encumbered ourselves in the African marketplace. And that's at least how I see it. But South Africa is interesting because it is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. As you pointed out, some unsavory elements are starting to manifest. Are you seeing, as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, an increased presence in Russian oligarchs and companies being set up in Africa?
I believe that there is a Russian presence. I don't think it is very obvious. If you just looked around, you wouldn't see it. I think it's very much under the radar. You see much more of China, but there's definitely a Russian presence over here. I don't know if you remember last year when South Africa ran military exercises with Russia, the Russian Navy off the Cape Coast.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, and then shortly after that, we actually had an incident where the American ambassador said, South Africa had been selling weapons to Russia. That I doubt, simply because we don't have that much in the way of stockpile of anything to sell to anyone. But it was an interesting observation and the start of a definite frost setting in between the relationship between the USA and South Africa. And I would say we're under grey sanctions that you can't really see, but it's kind of affecting the economy and so on.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I think that the line in the sand was the ICJ and how understanding that what South Africa was encouraged to do, using the ICJ mechanism, was certainly a giant middle finger to the United States' Israel or bust policy. So I'm not surprised that through the subtle mechanisms of international finance and various levers that America can pull, that Africa is now, to describe it, a bit on the shit list from the American perspective. But how much the American perspective really matters will be a question, I think, in the future. So one of the things that I think South Africa certainly desperately needs, from what at least we've been told in the West, is a greater capacity for desalinization, because there is a water crisis. However, the vintages of wine coming out of South Africa still remain some of the top and most coveted. Is there sort of a bit of hypocrisy, or how would you describe South Africa's current situation?
I think South Africa's current situation must be seen through the lens of BRICS.
Okay.
Just on the subject of a water shortage, mostly the water shortage is because the pipes break.
Okay.
There's really a water shortage as such. It's got a lot more to do with very old infrastructure. In fact, I had no water yesterday. So BRICS has become the all-encompassing focus of South Africa, and that is, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and it's just increased with a couple of other countries. Argentina did pull out. Now, there is something interesting that happened to BRICS after the Hamas attack, which I don't know if you are seeing it, and I don't know how much you are aware of how influential BRICS is. The point about BRICS is, without India, there is no BRICS. BRICS is the whole central point to BRICS. And after the Hamas attack, I follow a number of Indian geopolitics military analysts, and they said, whoa, there is no way India is going to be out-religioned, basically, in BRICS, because now we've got a very Muslim-dominant bloc. And so they were starting to go into reverse gear, and they've started firing up the IMEC trade route. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it basically Oh, wow, yes. It cuts out, it goes from India through KSA, Jordan, and then to Haifa.
Okay.
And it sort of cuts out the Red Sea, it cuts out China, and then it goes on to Greece. From Haifa, it goes to Greece.
Right.
So it's sort of a battle of trade routes, and that would be a direct competition for the BRI.
Okay, got it.
So we have had, there's an interesting shift happening in this alliance that I don't think people are seeing yet. I think probably who is seeing it and taking notice of it and making hay while the sun shines is Iran. And I'd be very interested in your views on Iran. Just briefly, as far as I understand it, they are in a precarious position domestically. Nobody really likes the mullahs. They're always at the sort of precipice of a revolution. And so they very much need everybody to unite behind a common enemy, sort of Goebbels style. And that may be one of the reasons that they pushed Hamas. I know the final training for the Hamas terrorists was done in Iran. And then suddenly we saw Iran has influence in a great deal more places than what I ever expected. And I think Iran coming into BRICS has sort of unbalanced what it was supposed to be, which was very much a sovereign countries and we all come together. And this is where I saw it going in a more malign direction, because if South Africa has aligned itself with Iran, well, we are now on a trajectory to a confrontation with Western powers. And I'm looking at the Iran, China, what's the other one? Iran, China, the other.
Well, Russia and North Korea.
Sorry, Russia. Yeah. That axis. And my goodness, had there been a lot of trips up and down between Moscow and Tehran. And there has been a lot of movement over there. And so I think what we're seeing now is BRICS is turning into something which is going to be, how do I put it? If South Africa didn't play ball with Iran and so on, my fear would be that the jihadis that have been pouring in from the north and are now sitting in one of our provinces, that they might activate and cause a civil war.
Wow. Okay. So much to unpick there. And I think probably we'll unpick and kind of, have some little closing statements on this. So I think what BRICS is it's an attempt to create a financial arrangement, if you will, that falls completely outside any American oversight and or influence. Okay. And this is a direct result of the desire for Iran, who's been doing this for many, many years, along with North Korea, to avoid sanction avoidance. The Russians are learning from the Iranian and North Korean experience on how to avoid sanctions. The countries involved in this are all skeptical about China. I think in terms of China is way closer to the West than the other three nations are, being totally folded into the idea of Western manufacturing is mostly taking place in China. So I think the BRICS countries, which include China, of course, are looking for mechanisms to work between each other as opposed to like using China as a central hub. Okay. The Chinese are interested in this because I think, flat out, there's an opportunity for them to make money as the money moves back and forth and to facilitate that. And there's always money in facilitation. Iran is interesting. I totally agree that Iran has internal dissent and internal politics that requires a great deal of effort to manage, and that the idea of a clear and common enemy is central to managing, I would say, that sort of growing discontent with the quality of life in Iran for the middle class and the lower class. 100% agree with that. What I find interesting is, again, this is maybe West being asleep at the wheel, and understanding that Iran doesn't just necessarily export terrorism, it exports the fundamental building blocks for destabilization through terrorism as a method, right? And this is where, Iranian investment over a number of years builds up a certain collective center of mass, if you will, that then, depending on what mullahs are dispatched, look for opportunities to claim righteous indignation over the treatment of the Muslims that are being fundamentalized and radicalized as a result of the structures that Iran put in place. Iran plays a multi-part, long game when it comes to establishing Islamic dominance in a particular area or region through proxies. But to be fair, and this is, I think, a critical point, there are some folks that are too crazy that for even Iranian sort of influence. A good example is ISIS and its continued presence in North African countries. ISIS is too fundamentalist for Iran. And it's interesting that Iran and some of the Al-Quds special forces have been used in direct battles with ISIS. And so this is a thing that not a lot of North American think tanks have really discriminated and distilled it down to understand that Iran even has limits to the fundamentalist movements that have been created in some places. So I think the synopsis is that the lack of, shall we say, Western focus on Africa's future, basically claiming the peace dividend of, Russia had, the Soviet Union had collapsed, Russia had gone away. Everybody was like, oh, okay, we're good. In terms of outside influence, the Chinese will never do business in Africa. And we're so myopic in that perspective. We haven't realized that, our traditional views of placation of Africa, which included aid and the war on terrorism, missed the entire redesign of the African continent courtesy of the terraforming efforts of Russia and China. Fascinating discussion. I guess you'll probably want to wrap it up now, but what are your sort of final thoughts?
Well, my final thoughts are, I actually have some questions for you. Do you think with Iran that they are that much concerned about the Sunni-Shia divide? Because would you agree that they have had a hand in training Hamas, and Hezbollah is more Shia, I think?
I'll even go one step further, and I love to say this, that true patriotism is finding somebody else to die for your country, right? and this is fundamental to Iran. Yes, I think very much the Saudi Arabia and Iran nexus exists and is a rivalry. What Iran has realized, though, is that recruiting poor, folks like Houthis and like Palestinians to do their bidding can project a certain amount of power, but again, it becomes difficult to raise funds and expand when you're faced with the behemoth of Saudi Arabia, right? So where I feel one of the reasons why Iran is looking at Africa as and to a certain extent represent Southeast Asia as a ripe recruiting ground is not necessarily to just get more bodies for the front lines, as it were, but it's also to give them a lot access to and a lot more maneuvering room in terms of financing operations that are going to be manifest themselves as anti-Saudi Arabian sphere of influence in the Middle East, right? You have to have money in order to perpetuate this, and you need, of course, the resources and the people. And so I think what they've figured out is they can essentially build these constructs that give them that level of flexibility to continue and sustain operations in both the Middle East and further abroad. And I will point out that Iran's biggest success is perhaps not coming from, the current situation with the Houthis and Hamas. It's the political maneuvering that they've managed to pull off to shift the attitude of the Iraqi parliamentarians into potentially, working at getting rid of a U.S. presence in the region. So they are playing a number of different games on sort of like that 3D chessboard. And it seems to be that they've been rather successful, since the beginning of the Hamas attacks on Israel. The world is somewhat distracted by the slow growth plan that Iran has unleashed into Southeast Asia as well as South Africa, and then of course Africa, which was its which was its home away from home, as it were.
Yes, absolutely. And then I'd like to ask you regarding the Houthis and the interruption of the Red Sea, because this is where I was going with. We are walking into World War III. I'm looking at the supply chain being cut. We've got a problem in the Black Sea, in Odessa, and then we have this problem with the Red Sea, and the USA does not appear able to contain it. Is there a reason for that? I mean, I know it's Iran really, but the Houthis themselves are kind of sort of backwoodsy, not a very impressive brainy bunch of people, and yet they seem to be dominating completely. And I'm not exactly sure how that has been allowed to happen, shall we say.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. I'm gonna poke at two things. So certainly they're acting on Iranian interest. All right. With the philosophy of if it's bad for the West, it's good for us, which is time-honored tradition. So that's one aspect of it. The second is we're in an election year, and increasingly the partisanship in the United States is such that the U.S. Navy could park the Seventh Fleet in the Red Sea and essentially annihilate everything that is interfering with the free movement of goods and trade, no question. But the problem is that's super expensive. And it would, of course, raise the questions of, well, why are we making all of these investments overseas if, at home we have, vet rollout, whatever group, in the United States, let's just, pick on the veterans and say, we have veterans sleeping on the streets, but yet we're spending millions and millions of dollars per day protecting, large corporations' global supply lines, right? This is a really difficult argument to make during the election period in the United States. And then lastly, I think it was we looked at the Saudis to contain the Houthi problem. And we looked at the Houthis as certainly being far more interested in, working and acting on behalf of the Iranians. But now that the Iranians backing Hamas have turned their attention to the international shipping lanes, they found a willing partner in that, gave them the drones, gave them some of the technology. We're in fact supplying intel on what ships were under what flags and where they were sailing, so that the Houthis could be more accurate in their geopolitical targeting. So there are so many different factors here, but I think the big takeaway for me is it's rather remarkable that a small group with access to high technology can have such a significant impact to global shipping and global commerce. And this is clearly, a result of these three things kind of coming together and manifesting themselves with a clear call to action, which was essentially anti-Israel and anti-Western sentiment that is now playing itself out in essentially what is a A2D anti-access area denial campaign that the Houthis have managed to be able to inflict.
Absolutely. Well, one more thing. I don't want to take too much of your time, but
no worries.
LNG, at this time with Nord being down, LNG is basically what Europe is relying on to power their economy. I recently read that Biden had banned the export of LNG until at least the elections, and I think the reasoning was something along the lines of to appease the climate change activists. Do you know anything about this, and would that not have a potentially catastrophic effect on Europe?
Yeah, so I don't know. It is probably the easiest thing. We do know that LNG is used in a variety of applications, not just necessarily power. Now, the good news is that for LNG, we're coming into the European summer, so the requirements for heating are not going to be nearly as severe. However, LNG also plays a role in the creation of fertilizers for crops. It also plays a role, of course, in air conditioning and power generation. So I guess where I think the United States is looking at doing is exerting its influence on controlling the price of LNG, and knowing that the United States has a ready stockpile that they could release to control the price isn't necessarily, as malevolent as we think it might be. I think it might be a way of controlling sort of knee-jerk reactions from various countries. I think also, though, that Russia's dependency on Western technology for the production and export of LNG is going to start, the sanctions are going to start impacting them. So it is, in my mind, a bit of a potential scenario where the LNG becomes almost a way of brokering power and controlling bad behavior, if you will. And so I think it's being looked at as a leverage. And it's also these type of things, and this is crazy, and it has to do a lot with the American psychology in this particular election year. But it's bonkers that basically if you ban something or if you prevent something from happening, that brings you bigger press and bigger headlines than if you facilitate something, if you create something, or if you open the doors to something, right? The reactionary relationship that the United States electoral process here is all about action, and things like banning and stopping are those action words that are just pablum to the insatious news appetite that the news organizations have. So I wouldn't read too much into it. And in terms of catastrophe, that is, I think, being kicked down the road. significantly kick down the road, and we'll see if we have a record hot summer, which we might have, and power generation requirements go through the roof. I can see a spike in LNG prices for sure, and vice versa as we get into a winter, and the Russian supply of gas is continued to be disrupted. We can also see another potential spike. So what we can be certain about is uncertainty.
For sure. And Ukraine seems to be in a downward spiral.
You think that, but today was announced a massive Ukrainian offensive. So, again, we're in this position of we don't really know. Mm-hmm. And I mean, honestly, if things are going super well, are you going to tell the enemy that you're doing super well? If things are going super bad, are you going to tell the enemy if things are going super bad? A lot of this has to do with political posturing and maneuvering. And, it's also sort of a bit difficult for Ukraine because they've been essentially, basically saying, oh, we're starved for weapons and, we're down to our last bits of ammunition, right? But at the same time, now there's announced that there's a big offensive that the Ukrainians starting. Well, you don't do an offensive if you're out of ammunition. It usually ends terribly, right? So again, where that truth lies is probably only in the high command of the Ukraine general staff and the Russian general staff. All I know is historically this area has been soaked in blood since even before World War II, and the back and forth war will probably continue for the foreseeable future over towns that aren't of any sort of major strategic importance. We're talking about towns that have 50 to 100,000 people that are across the front lines. And to be fair, the loss of one town in one area and the gain of one town in another area is not by any means a strategic outcome.
Most certainly not. And then finally, Moldova and Transnistria.
Yeah, a pipe dream. So in order to Russia to really put any resources, they would have to move those resources across Ukrainian airspace, or essentially figure out how to invade Moldavia and sustain like an airborne invasion style of thing across what can only be described as completely hostile territory. So I think that the Transnistria, I guess, is what they're calling themselves, stirring up trouble. Posturing will go for the foreseeable future, but Russia doesn't have the ability to sort of like reinforce or support that particular area of the world. It is they'd have to pretty much conquer Odessa first, and that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. So again, geopolitical ramblings and posturing with no practical means, I think, of execution.
Interesting. Very interesting. Is there anything else you would like to ask me?
No, I think, we've gone on.
Yeah,
it's been super interesting. It's been super interesting. You may have to release this in 2 parts. I don't know. But it was my absolute pleasure to talk to somebody that has got an idea of what's going on in your backyard, and I hope it was an enjoyable discussion.
Absolutely fascinating. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the invitation and your time.
My pleasure.